When people think of a god, they often picture a being of flawless morality, someone whose every action reflects absolute goodness, someone beyond human flaws. And in the Hindu tradition, the pantheon of gods is vast and complex, with each deity carrying their own myths, powers, and symbolic meanings. But the question we rarely pause to ask is this: if these beings are said to be perfect, morally perfect, do their stories actually reflect that? Or do they reveal something more human, something more imperfect, something that makes their moral authority worth questioning? Hinduism's gods are not a single unified figure like in some other religions. They're many, with diverse personalities, rivalries, loves, and hatreds. Krishna, Shiva, Vishnu, Kali, Durga, Rama. Each of them is woven into countless myths, stories passed down for centuries. And these stories aren't just entertainment. For millions, they're moral reference points, guidelines for how life should be lived. Yet, when you look closely, many of these tales don't exactly shine with the kind of perfect morality you'd expect from an all-knowing, flawless being. Instead, they often mirror the cultural values, politics, and prejudices of the times in which they were told. Take the story of Krishna, for example. In many traditions, Krishna is portrayed as a charming, playful figure, but some tales depict him stealing butter from villagers, or playfully harassing groups of young women by hiding their clothes while they bathed. In a purely symbolic sense, believers will say these acts represent divine playfulness or liberation from shame. But if a human being did the same thing today, we wouldn't call it divine, we'd call it harassment. And that's the thing. Morality is supposed to be consistent. If something is wrong for us, why is it good for a god? If the explanation is because he's God, then morality isn't being applied equally. It's being bent to protect the story, not the principle. Rama, another central figure, is worshipped as the ideal man. Yet in the Ramayana, after rescuing his wife Sita, he banishes her because public gossip questioned her purity. She had already proven her innocence through a trial by fire, but that wasn't enough. The decision was framed as his duty as a king to preserve public trust. But morally, it's punishing the victim instead of the accusers. It's enforcing societal prejudice instead of challenging it. If moral perfection means standing up for justice regardless of the cost, then this was not a perfect act. It was an act shaped by social pressure, the same way human leaders often cave to the opinion of the crowd. Many gods in Hindu mythology also engage in violence not as a last resort, but as a display of power. Wars between gods and demons are common, but so are conflicts between the gods themselves. Sometimes these battles begin over petty rivalries or wounded pride. Again, believers may say these are symbolic, cosmic struggles representing deeper truths. But why would perfection need to be dressed in the clothes of pettiness, envy, or revenge at all? Some might argue that these stories aren't meant to be taken literally, that the gods are metaphors for aspects of human nature. That's a reasonable perspective. And if that's the case, then the moral imperfections make sense. But the moment we interpret them literally as real beings with flawless moral authority, we run into a problem, because the actions in the stories don't reflect a universal moral code. In fact, they often reveal double standards. A god can lie, cheat, or kill, and it's called divine will. A human does the same, and it's sin or crime. This is not a consistent moral framework. It's a hierarchy where morality depends on power, and power belongs to the gods. We also have to remember that Hinduism evolved over thousands of years, absorbing and reshaping local myths, tribal deities, and cultural norms. What counts as good in one period might be different in another. When a culture glorifies warfare, the gods become mighty warriors. When a society values chastity, the gods enforce it. Morality here isn't descending from heaven, it's being projected upward from the ground. Even the concept of karma, while elegant in theory, often gets tangled in moral contradictions. If someone suffers, it's said to be the result of their own actions in a past life. This can lead to the idea that helping them might interfere with divine justice. In some contexts, that belief has been used to justify inequality, caste divisions, and discrimination. That's not moral perfection. That's a moral system that risks excusing injustice instead of fighting it. And here's the deeper point. If a god's morality can be reinterpreted endlessly, It becomes whatever the storyteller needs it to be. That flexibility may keep the stories alive, but it also means the gods are not fixed examples of perfect ethics. They are mirrors, reflecting back the values and flaws of the society telling the story. This doesn't make Hinduism unique. Every religion, when examined closely, shows that its deities carry the fingerprints of human culture. The jealous god of one tradition, the warlike god of another, the playful but morally questionable gods of another, all speak more about the humans who invented them than about some eternal, unchanging standard of goodness. In a way, that's what makes these myths so fascinating. They're not proof of divine perfection. They're evidence of how humans wrestle with the idea of perfection and often fall short. They're not rules handed down from the heavens. They're stories handed forward from one generation to the next, shaped to fit the needs of the moment. And maybe that's why it's worth asking questions about them. Because when moral authority is placed in the hands of beings who are immune to scrutiny, the danger isn't just theological. It's real and present. It's in how we excuse harm, enforce outdated norms, or look away from injustice because that's the way it's always been. True moral progress has often meant challenging the stories we inherit, rethinking the heroes we've been told to follow, and asking whether the examples they set actually make life better, fairer, kinder. When we do that with Hindu gods, or any gods, we find that moral perfection is less a quality they possess, and more a quality we imagine. And maybe, instead of expecting it to come from above, we need to build it ourselves, here, among us. Because in the end, a god's morality doesn't shape the world. Our morality does. Defenders often respond that these stories aren't meant to be taken literally, that the gods represent cosmic forces or aspects of human nature. That's a more symbolic reading, and if that's the case, then of course they'll have human flaws. But if they are symbols, then they aren't moral authorities. They're works of art and culture. The problem arises when these figures are treated as literal beings who set the ultimate moral example, because then the flaws in their actions become flaws in the very moral framework that believers are encouraged to follow. There's also the issue of selective interpretation. When a god acts in a way that seems good to us, it's held up as proof of their perfection. When they act in ways that seem wrong, we're told it's beyond human understanding. This double standard makes it impossible to meaningfully test their morality. It turns the gods into unfalsifiable figures, safe from any moral scrutiny. And we can see the effects in real life. In parts of India, certain social norms, like the idea that women should be subservient or that caste hierarchies are natural, have been justified through religious stories. The gods themselves are sometimes depicted enforcing these systems. And because they're seen as perfect, the systems they endorse are treated as natural laws rather than human constructs. Even the much-celebrated concept of karma, while elegant in theory, can lead to moral complacency. If suffering is believed to be the result of someone's past actions in a previous life, there's less incentive to address the social causes of that suffering. Poverty, illness, discrimination, all can be dismissed as the unfolding of cosmic justice. In this way, belief in divine morality can actually weaken human morality. And then there's the violence. Hindu myths are full of battles between gods and demons. Some are framed as necessary to preserve cosmic order, but others are triggered by pride, insults, or personal grudges. In one story, Vishnu takes the form of a dwarf to trick the demon king Bali out of his kingdom, an act of deception used to justify a power shift. If lying is wrong for us, but acceptable for gods when it suits them, then morality isn't universal. It's conditional and based on status. The deeper you go, the more you see that the gods' behavior reflects human desires, fears, and politics, not an otherworldly perfection. This isn't to say the stories are worthless, far from it. They're rich in symbolism, history, and cultural identity. But they are human creations. They carry the biases of the storytellers and the values of their time. And if we mistake them for flawless moral blueprints, we risk freezing those values in place, even when they no longer serve justice or compassion. True moral growth requires the ability to question, to look at even the most sacred story and ask whether it leads to a kinder, fairer world. If a god's action fails that test, it doesn't become good just because it's divine. Across history, human progress, whether in ending slavery, expanding rights, or challenging inequality, has often meant pushing against the moral authority of religious tradition. It has meant saying, "This may be ancient, but it isn't right." When we apply that same standard to the Hindu gods, we find that their morality is not fixed, universal, or perfect. It's fluid, adaptable, and deeply human. And that's the point. Perfection isn't something we find in ancient myths. It's something we build together through empathy, reason, and the courage to challenge old ideas. If morality is real, it shouldn't depend on whether someone is a god or a human. The same principles should apply to all. If we wouldn't excuse cruelty, deceit, or injustice from a person, we shouldn't excuse it from a deity. In the end, a god's morality doesn't shape the world, our morality does. And it's our responsibility to keep shaping it toward fairness, compassion, and truth. Not just repeating the stories we've inherited, but questioning them, learning from them, and sometimes letting them go. There's a deeper angle to this discussion that's often overlooked. It's the idea that moral perfection isn't just about avoiding bad acts, it's also about using power responsibly. If a being has unlimited power, their responsibility is greater than ours, not less. And yet, many Hindu myths depict gods using their power to win personal battles, settle scores, or protect their own honor above all else. For example, in the Mahabharata, Krishna advises the Pandavas in ways that bend the rules of war to ensure their victory. Bhima is told to strike Duryodhana in the thigh against the agreed rules because it's the only way to kill him. Believers see this as divine strategy. But if moral perfection means playing fair even when it's hard, then breaking the rules to win isn't perfection, it's pragmatism. And pragmatism is a human quality, not a divine one. Similarly, in some Puranic stories, Indra, king of the gods, behaves in ways that would make a modern audience question his fitness as a leader. He's jealous of potential rivals, quick to deceive, and sometimes destroys the lives of mortals out of fear that they might surpass him in devotion or power. If perfection means rising above petty insecurity, Indra doesn't pass the test. One might say these are just flawed gods meant to teach us lessons through their imperfections, but that argument only works if the tradition openly treats them as flawed. The problem is they are often still revered as moral examples, even in the very acts that would be morally questionable if done by anyone else. Anthropologists often point out that divine stories tend to reflect the social order of the time. In societies where kings were above the law, gods too were placed above the moral code. When rulers could punish without consequence, gods could too. When women were expected to serve and obey, goddesses might be powerful in myth, but still framed in ways that supported those roles. These aren't the fingerprints of perfection. They're the fingerprints of human culture shaping its own gods. There's also the idea of moral compartmentalization, where a figure can be praised for certain virtues while their harmful acts are ignored or reinterpreted. A god may be celebrated for protecting the world, even if they destroy innocent lives in the process. We do this with human leaders too, excusing the wrong because the person is too important or too good in other areas. But if morality is truly objective, the good can't erase the bad. This is why examining the gods' morality matters. Not because the stories are dangerous by themselves, but because uncritical reverence for flawed moral examples shapes the way people think about real-life authority. If we're taught that power justifies bending the rules, we're more likely to accept it from human leaders as well. And there's another subtle but powerful point here. Many believers say that divine morality is beyond human understanding, that if we think a god's action seems wrong, it's only because we don't see the bigger picture. But if morality can be anything depending on perspective, then it becomes meaningless as a guide. It stops being a compass and becomes a justification. In practice, humans already have the ability to evaluate right and wrong. We don't need divine endorsement to know compassion is better than cruelty. Fairness is better than bias. Honesty is better than deceit. These are values we can test in the real world by seeing what actually makes life better for people. When we step back and look at the full range of Hindu myths, a clear picture emerges. These gods are fascinating cultural figures, deeply symbolic, and full of human-like depth, but their actions are not consistently perfect, not consistently fair, and not consistently moral by universal standards. They are as complex, contradictory, and flawed as the humans who imagine them. And maybe that's the point. If we stop expecting moral perfection from gods, we can start taking responsibility for creating it ourselves. Because when you strip away the titles, the power, and the divinity, what you're left with are stories, and stories are tools. They can inspire, they can warn, but they don't replace the hard, ongoing work of deciding how to live, how to treat others, and how to make the world a little better than it was before. That work is ours, and it always has been. When you step back and look at it all, the ancient myths, the shifting moral profiles, the social systems reinforced by divine authority, the political uses of sacred imagery, one truth becomes clear. The gods of Hinduism, like the gods of every tradition, are as moral as the people who tell their stories, and as flawed. Their perfection exists only when we choose to see it, and the moment we stop choosing, the illusion fades. That's not necessarily a reason to discard the stories. In fact, it's a reason to value them differently. Instead of treating them as commandments from the sky, we can see them as cultural mirrors, records of what people once believed, feared, and hoped for. We can admire the poetry, the symbolism, the drama, without pretending they contain a flawless guide for how to live. Because when we insist that they do, we chain our morality to the past. We force it to follow rules written for a different world by people who didn't know ours. And we risk holding on to ideas not because they are good, but because they are old. The more honest approach, and the more courageous, is to admit that morality isn't perfect in the heavens. It's imperfect here on earth, and it's our job to make it better. That means testing every tradition, every rule, every example, divine or human, against the reality of whether it makes life more just, more compassionate, more fair. If a God story fails that test, we can let it go without letting go of our culture. We can tell it as history, as art, as myth, and still create our moral compass from what we know to be right here and now. The truth is, we don't need morally perfect dons to live moral lives. We need the willingness to question, the humility to admit when we're wrong, and the empathy to care about others even when there's no reward waiting in another world. Moral perfection isn't something we inherit from the past. It's something we build together, day by day and choice by choice. And maybe, just maybe, that's the unseen question behind every myth, every ritual, every act of faith. Not, are the gods morally perfect? But can we be moral without them? That's